This story comes from my great-grandfather, who is currently 101 years old. He has told it at family gatherings for years. He was born in Yugoslavia, Russia, what was then the Soviet Union. Naturally, he served under the Soviet Union during World War II. A few years after the war, he fled to the United States to escape communism. He retold this story to me recently. It happened shortly after the Battle of Iliki. Though not a major battle, it still led to significant Soviet and German bloodshed like most battles of that time. It was evening, and according to my great-grandfather, the night was hellishly cold. He and his comrades were gathered in one of the few undamaged buildings, a small house. Because it was warm, it became their spot for celebrating. They drank, sang, laughed, and joked, enjoying their victory after 2 brutal months of fighting. At some point in the evening, 2 fellow soldiers walked in. My great-grandfather and his friend Sergei didn't care for these two. They were loudmouths and generally unpleasant. Sergei suggested they go outside for a smoke, and my great-grandfather agreed. They bundled up in heavy coats and stepped into the freezing air. Lighting cigarettes for both of them, they stood in the cold, talking and relishing their hard-won victory. As they finished their smokes and prepared to go back inside, they heard a man scream from the woods. Fearing it might be a comrade under attack by a patrol of angry Germans, they rushed back inside to grab their guns. They rallied a group of soldiers and headed into the woods. My great-grandfather described an overwhelming feeling of dread and fear as they ventured deeper into the dark forest. When the screaming stopped, they decided to split into pairs to cover more ground. My great-grandfather and Sergei stuck together, while the others went in different directions. After about 2 minutes of walking through the cold, dark woods, they heard faint crying, someone in pain. Following the sound, they began noticing drops of blood in the snow. This discovery made them even more cautious. When they reached the source of the crying, they encountered a horrific scene: 2 German soldiers. One was dead, the other was alive but gravely injured. The dead man's body was mutilated, limbs missing, face skinned, uniform shredded, and scalp torn away. It didn't smell like death. My great-grandfather recalled it smelled chemical, almost unnatural. The surviving German soldier, cowering by a tree, didn't notice them at first. He was muttering something in German, his leg torn apart, his chest bloody. When Sergei approached, the soldier jumped back in terror, screaming in German something like "Das Kalles." Sergei put the soldier out of his misery with a single shot. Then they heard it, a low moaning sound. Suddenly, a tall, shadowy figure bolted through the darkness. My great-grandfather and Sergei opened fire in its direction, but it was gone. The other soldiers ran over, alerted by the gunfire, but the thing had disappeared. When they returned to their camp, they were reprimanded for leaving their post. Though a report was sent to high command, nothing came of it. My great-grandfather says it was the most terrifying experience of his life. He gets visibly distressed whenever he recalls the sight of the mangled soldier or the shadowy figure in the woods. I was 10 years old when my family moved to rural Mississippi. My dad had just gotten a new job, and we were leaving behind the bustling suburbs for a quieter, slower life in the countryside. At the time, I wasn't thrilled about it. The idea of being far away from my friends in the life I knew made me uneasy, but my parents kept saying it would be good for us, a fresh start. The house was old. It sat on a large plot of land, surrounded by thick woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were no other houses in sight, just trees and more trees. The nearest neighbor, my dad said, was about half a mile down the road. For the first few days, everything was normal. We unpacked our things, settled into our new rooms, and tried to get used to the quiet that seemed to hang over the place like a heavy blanket. At night, the silence was almost unbearable. No distant hum of traffic, no late-night chatter from the neighbors, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of the old house. But then something strange started happening. It began with our dog, Brick. He was a big, friendly golden retriever who had always been more interested in belly rubs than anything else. But after we moved, he became different, nervous, jumpy, always on edge. He would sit by the window, staring out into the woods, his ears perked up as if he was listening for something. And at night, he would bark long, deep barks that echoed through the house, waking us all up. At first, my parents thought it was just the new environment, that Brick was adjusting to the unfamiliar sounds and smells. But as the days went on, his behavior only got worse. He would refuse to go outside at night, his tail tucked between his legs, and he would growl at the slightest sound. My dad tried to calm him down, saying it was just animals in the woods, but I could tell he was starting to get worried too. And then we met Noah. It was a Saturday morning when Noah showed up. My dad and I were outside working on the fence that ran along the edge of our property when we saw a figure approaching from the road. At first, I thought it was just one of the workers who had been helping with the move, but as he got closer, I realized I didn't recognize him. Noah was an older man, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with gray hair that was thinning at the top and a face that looked like it had seen too much sun. He wore a faded plaid shirt and jeans that were frayed at the hems, and he walked with a slight limp. But what struck me most were his eyes, pale blue, almost gray, and sharp, like they were always watching, always calculating. "Morning," he said, his voice rough like gravel. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be the new folks." "That's right," my dad replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just moved in last week. I'm John, and this is my son." Noah nodded, his gaze flicking to me for just a second before settling back on my dad. "Name's Noah. Live down the road a bit. I thought I'd come by and say hello." "Nice to meet you," my dad said, extending a hand. Noah shook it, but there was something off about the way he did it, too firm, too quick, like he was just going through the motions. His eyes darted around the yard, taking in everything, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something interest, curiosity, maybe even a little bit of hunger. "You folks settling in all right?" Noah asked, still looking around. "Yeah, we're getting there," my dad said, forcing a smile. "House needs a bit of work, but it's a nice place." Noah nodded, his eyes finally resting on me. "Y'all be careful out here. These woods can be tricky, especially for kids." There was something in the way he said it that made my skin crawl, but I didn't say anything. I just stood there, feeling his gaze on me like a weight. My dad must have sensed my discomfort because he quickly changed the subject, asking Noah about the area, the neighbors, and the best places to go for groceries. Noah answered all the questions, but there was something strange about the way he talked. His sentences were clipped, his words carefully chosen, like he was hiding something. After a few minutes, Noah said his goodbyes and limped back down the road. My dad and I watched him go, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief when he finally disappeared from view. But the relief didn't last long. That evening, my dad pulled me aside, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "I need you to listen to me, son," he said, his voice low. "I don't want you going anywhere near that man. You hear me? If you see him, you stay away." I frowned, confused. Why? He seemed nice enough. My dad shook his head, his jaw tightening. "There's something off about him. I can't explain it, but I don't trust him, and I don't want you getting mixed up with him. Understand?" I nodded, but the unease in my stomach only grew. My dad wasn't the kind of person to get spooked easily, and seeing him this concerned made me worry even more. That night, Brick started barking again, louder and more frantic than ever. He was pacing back and forth in front of the window, his ears flat against his head, growling at something outside. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. I peered out the window, but all I could see were the trees swaying in the wind, the branches casting long, twisted shadows across the yard. There was nothing out there, or at least, nothing I could see. But Brick knew something was there, and whatever it was, it terrified him. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Noah's face, those cold, calculating eyes staring back at me. I kept hearing his voice in my head, telling me to be careful, warning me about the woods. And every time I thought of him, a chill ran down my spine. A few days later, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone whispering outside my window. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. Someone was out there, just outside my window, whispering my name. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I wanted to call for my parents, but I was too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. And then I heard it again, my name, whispered in that same rough, gravelly voice. Noah. I forced myself to sit up, my hands trembling as I reached for the curtain. Slowly, I pulled it back just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Noah was standing in the yard, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight, but there was something wrong with him. His skin was ashen, his eyes hollow, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. He was staring right at me, his head tilted to the side like he was trying to figure out what I was thinking. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on his, the fear paralyzing me. And then, suddenly, he was gone. I don't know how he moved so quickly, but in the blink of an eye, he had vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the lingering sense of dread that hung in the air like a thick fog. I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room, my heart racing as I banged on their door. My dad opened it, his face groggy with sleep, but when he saw the look on my face, he woke up fast. "What is it?" he asked, his voice urgent. "Noah," I stammered. He was outside. He was right outside my window. My dad didn't waste any time. He grabbed the shotgun he kept under the bed and hurried downstairs, motioning for me to stay close behind him. We checked every door, every window, but there was no sign of Noah. The yard was empty, the woods silent, but I knew what I had seen, and so did my dad. The next day, my dad started asking around, trying to find out more about Noah, but the more he asked, the stranger things got. None of the neighbors knew who Noah was. There was no record of anyone named Noah living in the area, no one who matched his description. My dad even went to the local police, but they didn't have anything on him either. It was like Noah didn't exist. That night, my parents sat me down and told me we were moving. They didn't give me a reason, but I knew it had everything to do with Noah. The next few days were a blur of packing and planning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see Noah standing there, that twisted grin on his face, those hollow eyes staring back at me. The night before we left, I had a nightmare. I was in my room, lying in bed, when I heard the whispering again. I opened my eyes, and there was Noah, standing at the foot of my bed, his face inches from mine. He was whispering my name over and over, his breath cold on my skin. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat up, trying to catch my breath, but the fear was still there, gnawing at my insides. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, we loaded up the car and left the house behind. As we drove away, I looked back one last time, half expecting to see Noah standing in the yard, watching us go. But there was nothing, just the empty house, the silent woods, and the lingering sense of dread that followed us all the way to our new home. My dad never talked about Noah again, and neither did I. We tried to put it all behind us, to move on with our lives. But I could never forget those hollow eyes, that twisted grin, the sound of his voice whispering my name. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in, I can still hear him calling out to me from the shadows. This happened shortly after my fiancée Morgan and I moved into our first house together. It's a modest, charming place in a quiet little town, perfect for us and any kids we might have one day. We met our neighbors early on. The couple next door was in their late 60s, friendly and welcoming. The other neighbors lived farther away, so we didn't meet them right away. At the time, we were still in the process of unpacking and furnishing the house. About 2 weeks into living there, we were exhausted every evening from balancing our jobs and setting up the home. One night, Morgan was cooking pasta in the kitchen while I sat at the table, browsing online for area rugs. The house felt a bit stuffy, so I walked over to the back door to slide it open for some air. That's when I saw him. A man was sitting in one of the chairs on our patio, hunched over with his head down. I froze. Whispering Morgan's name, I said, "Don't scream, but there's a man in the yard." She came over, gasped, and hid behind me. "Go say something." "No, wait, don't," she stammered. Truthfully, I didn't know what to do. I'm not a big guy, and even though the man had his back to us, he looked much larger than me. Morgan suggested I knock on the glass and yell at him to leave, but I hesitated. Finally, I mustered the courage, knocked on the door, and shouted, "Hey, you need to get off our property." The man turned to look at me. He stood up slowly, his face contorted into a half smile, almost like he was laughing. He appeared to be in his 50s, with a long gray beard and tattoos covering his arms. As he approached the door, I ensured it was locked. Standing just on the other side of the glass, he shifted his gaze to Morgan and started licking his lips, muttering vile, disgusting things about her. I yelled, "I'm calling the police," and closed the blinds. I called 911 and stayed on the line with the operator. The man eventually disappeared, but the experience left us shaken. The police arrived, searched the area, and took our report. We hoped it was over. Later that night, as we were watching TV, we heard noises from the yard again. I peeked through the blinds and saw him back again, smoking a cigarette and talking to himself. This time, he noticed me watching and sprinted to the window. He pounded on the glass, shouting obscene things about Morgan. I yelled for her to go upstairs, not wanting her to hear any more. I told him I was calling the police again, and he stopped pounding, retreating into the darkness. Once more, the police arrived, but the man had vanished into the trees behind the house. The next day, we went door to door, introducing ourselves to neighbors and asking if they knew who the man was. One couple a few doors down recognized him immediately. He was known for domestic abuse, drug use, and being generally dangerous. He lived in a small, run-down house just around the block from us. We reported him to the police again, but without video evidence, we couldn't press charges. Thankfully, we haven't seen or heard from him since. I hope it stays that way.